In spring of 1948, David Ben-Gurion, the leader of the Jewish Yishuv, the Jewish community in Palestine, had an impossible decision in front of him. The United Nations had voted for a partition plan and the recognition of a Jewish and Palestinian state. The British were leaving on May 14th, and his advisors told him not to declare a Jewish state, not to declare the birth of the state of Israel, because they were afraid that Israel would be invaded by foreign armies, by the Arabs, and many Jews would be slaughtered. David Ben-Gurion, who was steeped in Jewish destiny, Jewish history, Jewish tradition, did not listen to them. And at that faithful moment, he saw that this was the rising of the Jewish people. This was the culmination of the Zionist movement. And this was a moment in history which might not present itself again. And so on May 14th, 1948, in front of the new members of the Jewish government, of the first Jewish state since 2,000 years, in front of all the Yishuv, the new Jewish populations in Israel, and in front of the whole world, he declared the formation of the Jewish state in a declaration of independence. There was dancing in the streets, there was rejoicing. It was on a Friday, right before Shabbat. And the next day, the Arab armies attacked. Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Iraq. The Jordan Brigade, which was trained by the British, was the most difficult foe. And literally Jews who had just arrived off the boat, because now the British blockade was lifted, some of them were given a rifle and sent out to battle. And they didn't even all speak the same language. Yiddish was probably the most common one. And through heroism, grit, and Jewish ingenuity, and all of the weapons which were on order, mostly from Czechoslovakia, but which were quickly brought in because the British would not allow anything in. The British would not allow the Jews to defend themselves. They turned a blind eye to the Arab buildup, and yet stuck to the rules when it came to Jews not having weapons. Of course, clandestinely, many did. And the Haganah, the Irgun, had already become civilian fighting forces. And so in the first month of war, Israel was able to push the Arab armies to stop them and even push them back. And a ceasefire was declared, and over the next 10 months, there would be on and off ceasefires. The Arabs would try and regroup. The Jewish forces would push them further. And an incredible miracle, the Jewish state held its own. 6,000 casualties came out of that war, which was over 1% of the population. And the new boundaries of the state of Israel were formed. And if you look at this map on the left, was the partition plan presented by the United Nations, which was going to be administered. The orange areas are the Jewish state, the yellow area, the Arab state, and you see there are a series of triangles that aren't even really contiguous, that had a point of communication between them. And in the middle, you see the state, the newly formed state of Israel, the 1949 armistice line, which gave Jewish control, the state of Israel's control, to the entire area except the West Bank, what is called the West Bank, Yehuda and Shomron, and Gaza. Now, many sources will talk about stolen Palestinian land, that Israel stole 90% of Palestinian land. That figure is bandied about, but it is much more complicated and it is not accurate because you have to define your terms. What is Palestinian land? To the right, you see a map that shows us in blue the land that was bought by the Jewish National Fund, by the Jewish community, by internationally funded sources, Jews throughout the world who contributed to the cause. And from the 1880s to 1948, approximately 7 to 8% of the land was bought by the Jewish community. In green, you have Palestinian privately owned land, which was approximately 17% of the landmass. And the rest of the 75% of the land was state land. Now, here again, people often talk about the occupied territories. So we have to define our terms. What does it mean occupied? In order to be occupied, it had to have been held or owned or ruled by a permanent body. So what was the history? We saw last week that the Ottoman Empire controlled the land of Israel until the end of the First World War. It was given then to the British as a mandate to eventually hand over to local populations. The partition plan presented by the UN was never accepted by the Palestinians, and this is the main point. The Jewish community accepted the partition plan, accepted to divide the land, even though we were given a lot of our land, most of our land was desert in the Negev and not really cultivatable, although we managed to do so anyway. Part of the Galilee and the coastal plain, and that was it. We accepted that. The Arabs refused and attacked, and in the process, they were pushed back. And lands taken in a defensive war are legitimately claimed by those who were attacked. And in any case, there was no one to take them from because the Arabs never accepted the partition plan. So these lands were not, they were occupied in terms of being held by Israel, but no one ever had legal jurisdiction over them. Once the dust settled, Egypt will have control over Yehuda and Shomron, or the West Bank. Jordan will have control. Egypt will have control over Gaza. Now, another hot political issue that we have to look at, and we have to define our terms and look at what was the reality of what happened, was what is known as the Palestinian refugee crisis. During the War of Independence, some 700,000 to 800,000 Palestinians fled what became the future of Israel. And those who did not flee were given permanent residence and then citizenship in the new state of Israel. It was approximately 20% of the total population was Arab by the time the refugees had left. And to this day, 20% of the state of Israel are Arab citizens. So we have to make that clear as well. Now, why did these refugees flee? So this is also a very contested question and issue. There were reports of Jewish slaughters, Jewish massacres, which were amplified by the Arabs, which certainly created a fear and created a fleeing. There were Arab terrorists attacking from civilian populations, which caused the Jewish defense forces, the Israel Defense Forces, to attack back, sometimes with human shields being used, and nothing is new. Some of those villages, there were civilian casualties, along with the terrorist casualties. Some of them, because of the ongoing terrorist attacks were cleared out and the populations were moved, particularly in the Jerusalem corridor, the road leading to Jerusalem. Jerusalem was besieged and was on the point of starvation. And eventually the Arab Legion of the Jordanian fighting forces will take the old city and expel all the Jews. And some of them fled because the Arab countries were broadcasting on the radios telling them to pull back so they could go in and massacre everyone, and then they would return. And some of it was general fear of war. Now, there were also incidents like in Deir Yassin, a village on the road to Jerusalem, where terrorists were attacking from. The Irgun fighters went to neutralize the terrorists. They did have loudspeakers on trucks, which were telling the local population to clear out because this was going to be a war zone. The historical reports show that after a short while, those trucks did break down. The truck broke down, so the word could not get out. After a short battle, the population was rounded up, but amongst the civilian population were terrorist fighters posing as women and disguised, pulled out guns, shot at the Jewish and Israeli troops, and they shot back, and civilians were killed. It was called the Deir Yassin massacre. The rumor spread was that the Israeli army was systematically massacring civilians. There was also another report of 26 Arabs burnt alive in another village. The UN sent an investigative team and found that no such event had happened. So paradoxically, the Arab reports of Israeli massacres amplified the fear and the flee. These figures you see here are written by historian Benny Morris in The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem. He is an Israeli historian who at the time was rather left-leaning, and he did this study to see who caused it. Was it a Jewish expulsion? Was it the Israeli expulsion of the Arabs? Was it fleeing? Was it a combination? And the other thing we have to say is, in the fog of war, it's even difficult to try and parse out what these different categories are. 40 to 50, it says, were fear of war and combat. 30 to 40% expulsion by Israel. And was that expulsion done because there were terrorists invading? Was it done consciously to rid areas of Arab populations? These are also open questions. 10 to 15% no Palestinian leadership. 5 to 10% fear of massacres, and 5% Arab call to evacuate. Which, of course, all this is very difficult to determine. But the point is, it was a number of different factors, and this is what the Arabs call the Nakba, the disaster. Now, when we talk about refugees from the War of Independence and from the forming of the State of Israel, the picture is much more complicated because the Palestinians weren't the only refugees. And close to 800,000 Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews were kicked out of Arab countries after the formation of the State of Israel. Here on the left, you see already during the Second World War, anti-Jewish riots in Baghdad, in Iraq, the Fahud, and these persisted after the formation of the State of Israel. And then there was a systematic policy to confiscate all belongings. Jews were sent packing without even being able to take their assets. Here you have 1949, Operation Magic Heartbeat from Yemen. And the story is that some of these rural Yemenite Jews had never even seen an airplane. And so when the Torah says that God will take you on eagle's wings and bring you to Israel, they saw the planes landing. Sure enough, here were the eagle's wings. And maybe that's in fact what the Torah was talking about. And the figures are, and here you see the enormous size of the Arab world, the tiny Jewish state, and the hundreds of thousands of refugees that were kicked out. So discussion about the law of return of Palestinian refugees to Israel, any such discussion would have to talk about a law of return and return of assets of Jewish refugees from Arab lands as well. In addition, the Jewish refugees integrated into whichever countries they went to, many to Israel, others to different countries abroad. And you might not have heard about this because they don't brand themselves as stateless refugees. This is in contrast to the Palestinian refugees who, even when they went to other Arab countries, Jordan, Gaza, in Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, they were kept, and to this day are still kept in refugee camps, funded by the UNRWA, the only body in the UN that has multi-generational refugees. All of the refugees from wars are integrated into the countries that they go to the point where when Israel took Gaza and built housing to give permanent residence to these refugees and not have to live in camps, they were afraid to move in because they knew that the Palestinian leaders would kick them out and persecute them because they'd moved into such housing. So it's a very complicated issue and one that is still hotly contested. The absorption of hundreds of thousands of new immigrants in Israel was ongoing and was challenging and difficult. Here you see what are called the Ma'barot, the absorption centers, some living in tents. Bottom right, you see at least some of them had trailer homes that were built for them, often in the deserts, at terrible temperatures, no air conditioning, but they made the best of it. And the country struggled in the early years, in the 1950s. There were severe shortages, rationing of basic staples, but the country pressed on and started to build itself and continued to build into a new flourishing state. In 1956 is another one of the wars, and by the way, unfortunately, a lot of this history of the new state is going to be the history of wars. And while it does not define who we are, certainly, and most notably, the Israeli army is called the Israel Defense Forces. We never looked for wars. But unfortunately, it was these wars which marked a lot of our early history and also brought about significant transformations. Here you see, paradoxically, before 1967, Israel's main allies were the French, who provided weapons, and the British in this case. The French and the British had designs on the Suez Canal. The Egyptians, who were antagonistic to Israel, had closed the Straits of Tiran, which can be considered an act of aggression because Israel could not bring its commerce in. And with British and French support, the Israeli army attacked. They effectively were able to take most of the Sinai Peninsula, and the US and Russia made the Israel coalition withdraw. But it was the first sign of the effectiveness of the fighting of the Israeli army, and also interesting alignment of who our allies were at their time. Throughout the 1960s, the Israel fighter jets were the Mirage jets from France. Now, also another significant issue, social and political, which emerged with the newly born state of Israel in the 1950s, was Israel's response to the Holocaust. Israel's response, in part, was one that they heard that Adolf Eichmann, who masterminded the final solution, when they heard he was still living in Argentina, the Mossad pulled off a daring raid where they kidnapped him and brought him back to Israel and put him on trial for crimes against humanity. And some historians wrote about the banality of evil. He said, I was just a technocrat following orders. Of course, that was not an excuse. And in fact, he had masterminded and carried out the final solution, which brought to the extermination of millions of Jews. And this is the only time in Israel's history where capital punishment was used. Another hotly contested issue earlier in 1952 was overtaking reparations from the German government. The German government wanted to make restitution to the Jewish survivors and for the terrible crimes that they had done, and offered financial compensation. The state of Israel, as we talked about, was in a very difficult financial state, was struggling to even survive, and the money was very much needed. But there was one figure who we've already mentioned, Menachem Begin, who was the opposition, the head of the parties that were not part of the majority labor government, and he virulently opposed this. Remember, his parents had been killed in the Holocaust, and here you see the sign, Nimche et cherpa, wipe out this embarrassment. And he screamed in the Knesset, made a scene, would not leave, was carried out, and continued his demonstration against it outside the Knesset in the streets, gathered crowds, tried to disrupt the vote ineffectively. And in fact, Israel accepted the reparations. And I remember when I first came to Israel, you saw a lot of Mercedes-Benz cars and buses all over and trucks, which was part of the reparations. And paradoxically, my mother, who was a refugee and fled Austria, was put on a kinder transport. My father, who fought in the American army in Germany, who refused to buy German products and said, I don't want to see those things in our house. And that was a number of years ago. Today, I have a somewhat different outlook because, first of all, the Germans did try to make amends, and they're still the strongest ally we have in Europe, although the bar isn't very high. They, as we say in Jewish tradition, did tshuva, tried to repent for what they did, recognized their evil, tried to make amends for it, unlike the Austrians who claimed we were invaded. My mother was from Austria, and the Anschluss, they welcomed the Germans with open arms, yet then they turned around after the war and said, well, we were invaded. So today, it is a different generation in Germany as well. Germany is our strongest ally in Europe, and things have changed, but one can understand Menachem Begin's position at the time. Another cultural issue, which was hotly debated that we've talked about, was the playing of Wagner's music, who was a rabid anti-Semite and a great classical musical composer. And this was battled over as well as whether his music should be played in the new state of Israel. Another bright point of Israel's rapid development was the movement towards what we call ag tech. Jaffa oranges were already legendary in Israel, and that was cultivated and became a good source of export and of foreign money coming in. And it was not just oranges, but all, I picked avocados and grapefruits when I first arrived. And all of this was made possible by water. In the Middle East, water is a vital asset. And in 1964, Israel established a national water carrier, which brought water from the Kinneret, from the Sea of Galilee, throughout the entire country, allowed, of course, for drinking water and for agriculture. And Israel then subsequently developed breaking technology, innovative technology, the drip irrigation, which was then exported to other countries as part of Israel's aid programs. And particularly in the 60s, Golda Meir promoted this to use the goodwill as a foreign policy move, but also representing Jewish values of tikkun olam, of helping the world, of helping fight poverty. And we developed this great technology, and we should share it with the world. In addition, later on, in the last decade or so, Israel became cutting edge in water desalination, which is now the majority of our water is very high quality and comes from desalination to the point where water has no longer become a drastic issue in Israel. I remember we used to always follow the level of the Kinneret. Is it above the red line, below the red line? You'd have a few dry winters and it would be a crisis. Then you'd have a bumper rain and snow in one winter and it would refill. And those days have been moved on. But we see the beginnings of Israel's tech development and innovation. And so the young country was born. The young country was absorbed hundreds of thousands, millions of new immigrants. The young country was developing and finding its place in its own, in the world, and in its own self-development. It was largely a very socialist-oriented, of course, the legendary kibbutzim being a great source driving agriculture, the communal farms that were developed, and the labor unions, the Histadrut, which we talked about even before the founding of the state. Most of the large industries were state-owned, and in the first years of the country, that allowed for central development and for rapid growth. And we will see that that will change over time. But Israel, in its first few decades, was an incredible success story and one which showed great promise for the future.